Hello, everybody, and welcome to Science Live. I'm your ventriloquist host, Mr. Roger Patterson. We got you introduced to the video there with Ulrich's close-up of his face, but I'm joined today by Dr. Georgia Purdom.
Hello.
And we're coming to you again from Discovery Hall. This is one of the main places we do our workshop programs. When the museum is open, we have guests in here and do all types of teaching. All of our speakers are involved in teaching all of these different topics. So once everything reopens, this is a great space to come and learn more about the things, lots of things like we're talking about today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we learn about feathers, we learn about bones, we learn about blood, all kinds of cool stuff.
Yep. And we are going to be looking at bones today. That's our main topic. And when I think about the body and how I learned about all of these things, of course, studying these things in college was a big part of my learning about all of these pieces and anatomy and physiology. We call it A&P for short. And you actually taught anatomy and physiology.
I taught anatomy and physiology to nurses actually for 6 years, and teach some of that online now too. So it keeps me a little bit up to date with all of these things and remembering, because there's a lot to it.
Yes.
I mean, when you look at
and
that.
I think, let's see, it's been 20 plus years since I had A&P, but I was a coach and did sports medicine and training and those types of things, so got some refreshers in those. But there's so many hundreds of muscles and bones and the way the nerves connect and all these pieces that it's an incredibly complex field, and people could spend their whole careers studying just one of these things.
Oh yeah.
All right. Probably have everybody on now. We've got notifications that have gone out. And remember, if you aren't subscribed to Ken's page and have that notification button checked, you won't get these notifications. So click those buttons and get those notifications. I'm Mr. Roger Patterson, and I'm joined today by Dr. Georgia Purdom. And we're going to be talking to you today about the human arm. That's our main focus.
And don't forget, if you have a question, be sure to put your name and age and your question about whatever we're talking about here today, and we'll try to get to it. That makes it much more fun for you and for us.
Yes, we love to interact with you and answer these things as they come up. Okay, we're going to start out today with a quiz. We've been doing lots of quizzes lately. So what's one of the major differences between clawed, organisms like clawed, and organisms like us as humans? Okay? There are some key differences, and we're going to talk about that key difference today as we think about the way we're built and the structure of our bodies. So if you think about clawed, he has, this one's just plastic, but if he were real, he has a hard exoskeleton. Okay? So when we think about that word exoskeleton, you probably know skeleton means that's the support structure, but an exoskeleton is on the outside. So Claude's bones, if you were, are on the outside. Right. Our bones are on the inside, so we have an endoskeleton. So there's your big science words of the day. Okay? Exoskeleton versus endoskeleton. But we're going to have a lot more big science words today.
You can't do anatomy without that.
And we're not going to get into too much detail. And as we say all the time, we're going to cover some basic principles today. Everything is so much more complex than what we're going to be talking about. But we'll try to bring it to a level that's really understandable and gives you some application, how you can think about the way your body moves and the way God's designed it to do that. Okay, so let's jump in. When we think about the arm, technically the arm is just the section from your shoulder down to your elbow, and then this is called the forearm, and then we have the wrist and the hand. But we'll think about the arm as a whole structure today in that common term. But in anatomy, we call it the forelimb, and it's broken into those three basic regions. So our arm, if we can bring the camera in here, has three basic bones in it that make up the main structure. So this is a right and a left, so we have a matched pair here. So this is the humerus, and that's not very funny, but sorry, bad dad jokes. Okay. This humerus bone is the big long bone that connects from your shoulder down to your elbow. Okay. So if you reach up to your shoulder, you can feel this little point on the outside of your shoulder is where that humerus bone is connected right there. And we'll talk about this joint in a second. We move down here along the humerus. This would be the elbow joint. And this joint connects to two bones below it. They're called the ulna and the radius. So if we think about the different structures right here, you can reach, if you put your hand out flat and you reach on the inside of your elbow, right up in here. Let me go ahead and pull my sleeve up just a little bit. This bump that you feel right here on the inside of your elbow is this bone right here, the curve of this bone coming out right here. So you can feel a lot of these bony structures inside your body, and we'll look at some more of those as we go through this. Okay, the ulna is this bone coming down here. It's the smaller one, and it has this rounded tip at the end. And the radius is this bone here. It's on the outside if your hand is, if your palm is up, and it's stretching down here. And then this would connect into your wrist area down in here. Okay. Now, it's a little cumbersome for me in this lab coat, so I'm going to take off my lab coat. This might be the first time you guys have ever seen me without my lab coat on.
Well, somebody said you're not exercising your right to bear arms.
I am going to, okay. So I wore this shirt today with a nice loose sleeve so we could pull it up and think about all of these pieces. So if we think about, we'll use the right arm over here. If we think about this joint up here, you notice that this makes a ball structure. Looks like a little ball. And if we could look at the rest of the shoulder, that ball is actually the joint, and we call that a ball and socket joint. So let's come over here to Ulrich and take a look on Ulrich. So you'll notice this is the top of the humerus, okay, top of his arm bone, and this curve right here on the top of the humerus fits inside of this curve on this bone that's called the scapula. And you would probably know that as your shoulder blade is the common term for that. And then up here that connects to the clavicle, which we also call the collarbone, if you said that, waiting for me to pause there. So the clavicle or the collarbone and the scapula or the shoulder bone, all of those connect into the top of the humerus. And these are all important. All of this works as a ball and socket. So the arm can rotate up and back and in and out in all these different directions because it has this round surface. Okay, so we call that a ball and socket joint. So if we think about the movements of an arm, there are basically 6 primary movements. Okay, we have abduction that comes up, and we have adduction that comes in. We have the flexion of a joint, and we have the extension of a joint, and then we have supination and pronation when we turn a joint like this. So there are lots of different motions that we think about when we're making all of these things. So what makes all of those motions possible, Dr. Purdom?
Well, bones, muscles, tendons, ligaments, all of those things.
All of those things have to happen. Not to mention we have to have nerves that are sending signals in there, and we have to have blood supply to get blood and nutrients and oxygen in and out. So this is an amazingly complex process. Just for you to raise your arm
you have no idea of all the things that
all the things you'd have
on.
to think about just to raise your arm. And all of it happens instantly in our brains because God's made us in this amazing way.
Okay, somebody wants to know, Xander, is there a difference between male or female shoulder bones?
We talked with Dr. Rivera just a little bit about difference in bone structure and how we can actually determine gender. You would probably see in males, they would tend to have a little bit thicker structure in those bones. That would be the primary difference. But then again, that's going to vary between individuals. So that wouldn't be a key gender identifying bone. We'd think more about the shape of the skull and especially the pelvis. And even the femur can help us with those things. So those would be the main bone gender identifying bones. Okay, so if we think about 2 terms you said just a second ago, tendons and ligaments. Okay, those are 2 different words, and those are part of a bigger group of tissues that we call connective tissues. So these are connecting things. So if you think about this joint down here that makes up your elbow, okay, this joint actually has little pieces of connective tissue that connect this bone to this bone. So the radius is connected to the humerus by a set of tissues that we call ligaments. So ligaments always connect bone to bone. And then if there were a muscle attachment, so let's say the biceps muscle sits right in this region, the biceps muscle is attached from the top up here to the bones by what we call tendons. So tendons attach muscle to bone and ligaments attach bone to bone. And then between the joints, we can't see it here, but there's actually a layer of cartilage. And that allows a kind of a cushion and a smooth surface for those joints to run on. Now, if you've ever cut up a whole chicken before, this is a fun exercise. If you think about where the leg connects into the thigh, or the thigh bone connects back into the hip socket, you can cut that and open that up and rub your finger on that next time you do that. And you'll feel it feels really, really slippery and smooth. Okay? That's called synovial fluid, and the surface of that cartilage is very smooth and nice. Unless you get old like me and your knees fall apart.
It's kind of like, even if you have something that has a hinge on it, you sometimes have to put oil in it or something to make it work well, so the surfaces slide over each other well. And it's the same thing with us. It's not oil, but it's this synovial fluid and other fluids in there and cushions and things that help those things slide over each other.
So that acts as a lubricant. Right. So God's given that to us, and our bodies continually supply that. But as we get older, if there are injuries and things, that decreases and your body makes less of that and things wear out.
You make more noises when you go to kneel down.
Yes, that's for sure.
Cracks and pops.
Okay, so we called this joint on the shoulder a ball and socket joint. So let's come back over to Ulrich over here. The joint here at the elbow, you'll notice it only goes one direction. I can't really move it side to side. It only goes one direction, and so we call that a hinge joint. And so that hinge joint allows it to move back and forth. Okay? Now down at the wrist, we have a much more complex joint. This actually is a hinge joint here, where these two bones of the arm join into the carpals. Okay? And then these bones are called the metacarpals. So there are 8 bones in your wrist we call carpals. You may have heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. That's where you get problems with the nerves in this area from moving your fingers too much if you're typing or things. These would be the bones of your hand. Okay, so you've got 5 of these bones inside of your hand, the metacarpals, and then these are your phalanges. So each of your phalanges has 3 bones. Okay, we call this the distal, medial, and proximal. Those are fancy words that mean middle, far away, and close. If you think about proximate and distance and middle or median. But your thumb only has 2. Okay? It doesn't have that third one at the tip. So only 1 knuckle. So each of these joints is a knuckle. And those are also hinge joints. They can only bend in one direction. The wrist also does another cool thing. It can turn inside and out. So we call that supination and pronation. So if we think about my arm over here, I can move my arm inside and outside. Okay? And this is the way I remember, which is my radius and my ulna. So if you hold your hand out flat and you put your finger right here, one of the bones is going to rotate and one of them is going to hold still. So this bone right here, I can feel on the edge of my wrist, that's a little bump right here, that's the edge of my ulna. And the radius is over here on my thumb side. And notice the radius rotates. If my finger's the pivot, my radius bone up here is rotating back and forth. And so we think about radius and circle and rotate, that all kind of makes sense. So that's the way I always remembered which one was the radius, because it can rotate outside of there. So we've got a hinge joint in our elbow. We've got a more complex joint here that allows us a hinge and then rotation both ways. We've got hinges in our fingers. We've got a ball joint up in our shoulder. So all of those things are different ways that our bodies move, and God's created us with very specific joints and motions to be able to accomplish lots of different things. Okay.
Hey, we have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So Ethan, age 5, wants to know where you got the skeleton.
I don't know. It's a model that we purchased for Dr. Menton to use. He talks a lot about bones. He'll be with us on Friday's program. He was an anatomist, so his training was teaching doctors about anatomy and cellular structure and all of those types of things. So this was purchased for him so he could have a teaching model, and so I'm just borrowing it from him, basically.
All right, McKenna, age 10, wants to know what it means when someone says they've pulled a muscle.
Pulled a muscle. Okay, so if you think about a muscle, we'll go ahead and use that as a springboard into talking about how our muscles move our body. If you think about a muscle, think about a bunch of fibers that are kind of interlocked like this. And when a muscle contracts, those fibers kind of squeeze together and it makes the muscle shorter. And when a muscle relaxes, it pulls those fibers apart and lets them spread apart. If you were to overstretch it, you would actually tear or pull that muscle. It's usually talked about a tear if there's a significant portion of it and one of the bands separates, and there are different degrees of tears that we talk about. So pulling a muscle is actually overstretching a muscle so that it actually rips the tissue and does damage to the tissue. The other type of damage that we would have associated with muscles would be either a tendon strain or a ligament sprain. So if we think about straining and spraining our bodies, that's where the ligaments or tendons get stretched out of proportion and they get pulled. Sometimes they can pop off the bone. They pull pieces of the bone off with them. Yeah, I see some grimaces in the audience right now, but those are injuries that happen to our body when they get extended, they get stretched or flexed outside of what their normal range of motion is. Okay? So range of motion then is what we talk about. Our bodies can move in different ways. So if I think about my elbow joint, okay, I have a range of motion. If you notice, my elbow is a little weird. It curves down a little bit. You might look at different members of your family. My daughter's does that even more because she has a connective tissue disorder and those ligaments and tendons are not tight in her body. So it allows her to be hyper flexible and she can actually extend her arm even further than mine. Okay, so this motion we call extension around the center of this joint, and this motion we call flexion. So a range of motion involves the extension and flexion of a joint. So when I extend and flex this joint, I could actually measure the angle right here and come up with that range of motion. When I've gone through rehab after I had knee surgery, I could only move my knee a little bit, and over time I was able to get it more. And the physical therapist was always working on that type of thing. Okay? So what allows that type of motion? Here's the question. Okay? So what allows that type of motion? I have a group of muscles. Now, no making fun of my skinny little arms. Okay? This muscle up here is the muscle that does the flexion part. It flexes or closes the joint. And this muscle down here is the one that does the extension of the joint. So a lot of our muscles work in pairs, in coordinated pairs, so that we get a flexor muscle and an extensor muscle. So the flexor muscle in my upper arm here is called the biceps, if you said that's correct. Okay? So the bicep allows me to flex the joint, and the tricep down here allows me to extend the joint. Now, am I flexing my bicep or flexing my tricep? We use that word kind of loosely. You have to flex your tricep in order to extend your arm, but you have to flex your bicep in order to flex your arm. So really, flexing a muscle is a kind of a sloppy way to talk about it from anatomical terms.
So someone wants to know, Becky wants to know, what is double jointed?
Double jointed. It's kind of a loose word we use to talk about, a better anatomical term would be joint hypermobility. So if a joint is intended to have a normal range of motion, and that motion is here, but there's something malformed or there's a loose tendon or loose ligaments, then you get hypermobility. So that range of motion is greater. So I would say my elbow is hypermobile because it extends past.
And my
Some people
legs
would have
are
thumbs.
actually double jointed,
Okay.
so I can do some strange things.
Some people will hold out their thumb, and we call it Hitchhiker Thumb, if your thumb curves back. And that's because the muscles back here, the tendons and ligaments the ligaments inside here are loose, and that allows your thumb to bend backward. Okay? And you could look at different members of your family and see if that works.
It's genetic too.
Yes, and it's a genetic marker.
It's a genetic trait.
How far you can bend your fingers back. So double jointed is kind of a colloquial term
Right.
for what we call hypermobility in those different joints. I can kind of, it's called subluxation. I can pop my shoulder out of socket, but
Let's not
that'll
try
gross
that.
people out. So you probably can't do that, and it only happens on my left shoulder and not my right. So different joints in our bodies are structured different ways. Other questions coming in yet?
I want to say happy birthday to Luke.
Oh yes, Luke,
birthday,
happy
Luke.
birthday. I saw that
So,
yesterday. He posted
yeah,
he's turning
yeah, so
11 today, I
yeah,
believe.
he's turning 11. I think that was, I was looking, because there's a lot of comments. You guys are doing a really good job. All right, no, that's up for now.
Okay, so when we think about that flexion and extension, the biceps muscle attaches down here. So in anatomical terms, we call where the muscle attaches up here the origin. That's the spot that stays still, and down here the insertion. So there's two heads of the bicep. So it's got two different heads. They come up this way. One attaches on the front side of my scapula, and one attaches on the back side of my scapula, my shoulder blade. And then it comes down here, and there's a tendon that crosses across my elbow, and it attaches down inside of here into the inside of my ulna. And that is what allows it to pull. So when this muscle, if I touch this muscle right now, it's kind of soft, and this muscle back here is softer because it's all relaxed. This one's kind of stretched out. I can put pressure in here, and as I contract that muscle, it gets firmer. Okay? And that firmness is those bands in my muscles sliding together and getting tighter. Down here, my tricep now, it's not doing much work, so it's kind of relaxed. And I can push in on it. But when I flex it, it gets tighter. So the flexion of the joint or the extension of the joint causes the muscles to contract. You can see that really well on my forearm. Same thing happens here. We have flexors on this side of our arm that cause the hand joint to close, and we have extensors that cause it to open. So if we bring the camera right in here, you can see I can push into this muscle group very easily. It's really soft right now because it's relaxed. When I flex that muscle, you can see it gets very tight. Okay? That tightness in the muscles is the contraction and all those pieces coming together. If I relax that and pull my extensors, they're tight over here now, and this one is soft because those muscles are moving and working that way together.
Okay, so someone had actually posted this, and so someone's asking, is this correct, that there are no muscles in the hands and feet?
That is incorrect. There are, if we bring the camera in here, I can prove to you that there are muscles in my hand. Okay? If I think about right here, we have a major muscle. You can see that muscle contract when I pull my thumb in. So I'm abducting that thumb muscle. So there are abductors and adductors that pull these things in and out. So there are definitely muscles inside your hand. Where there are not muscles are inside of your fingers. Okay? The muscles back in through that move your fingers actually come clear up into your forearm. So if I move my middle finger, you can actually see, I hope we can see this little muscle flexing right up here. If I move my ring finger, it's this muscle flexing right in here. Okay, so we see
And
different,
back here.
yeah.
You can see it in
because
multiple places.
Okay, so flexor,
Yeah.
extensor. Every one of my fingers has a flexor muscle and an extensor muscle that's continuing back on opposite sides to be able to pull it in and pull it out. So that flexion and extension. So we've almost always got pairs of muscles that are working together. In your hip, there's an abductor and an adductor muscle. We'll talk about legs in the body next week. So all of those things work in pairs. So yes, there are muscles in your hands, but not in your fingers. Okay, here's another model we can use to talk about the structure of the arm. So this model is built, so this would be the shoulder up here. Here's the elbow joint. So it's set up as a simple hinge. Okay? It can only move in one direction. And when we talked about the origin and insertion of the muscles, this is used to demonstrate that. So up here is the origin of the muscle. It would actually be attached up higher into the scapula. So we're going to call this point the origin, and then we're going to call this point the insertion, where the muscle attaches to the bone that's going to move. So whichever bone moves is the insertion. Okay? Now I'm going to slide this over just a little so I have a bit more room. If we think about the design of our arm, we think about designing cranes and large things that move big, heavy loads. Our arm is basically a crane, and God's designed it in a very specific way to do specific functions. And I challenge you today to go 10 minutes without using your arms to do something. Just let them hang at your side for 10 minutes, and you'll be very frustrated because we use them for everything all the time. Okay, so this design is set up as what, if you've studied physical science, we call a third-class lever. So a first-class lever is like using, if we had a crowbar and a rock, and we've got a force or a weight down here and a force down here, we're prying it up. A wheelbarrow is a second-class lever where you have a fulcrum here, you've got the load here, and then the force is being used up here. Our arm is a third-class lever. So the effort is being applied here in between the fulcrum and the resistance. So this weight would represent something you were picking up with your hand. Okay? If we can bring the camera in here, what we've got is a scale. And I'm going to use this scale to hold that arm about 90 degrees. And it's upside down, but I can read that in newtons. That's reading about 6.2 newtons at this insertion point. What if the insertion point were different? What if I changed the position of that insertion point? So let's go ahead and move it in closer. And give it a pull. Now, if this is getting closer to the fulcrum, if you've studied physical science, make a prediction about what you think the force required is going to be. Is the force going to be greater or less? So let's use this scale to find out. You get that at 90 degrees. I'm clear down to like 8.8, almost down to 9. So it required more force to lift that from that position. Let's move it into the third insertion point. And this insertion point would represent more closely where it actually is on our arms. So when I pull this down, get that up to the 90 degrees, it is off the scale. Okay? So probably like 10.5. So it takes more effort to raise it. So Dr. Purdom, you want to explain for a minute why some people might think this is a bad design, why God did a bad job designing our bodies?
Because they would say, well, if you have to use more force, then you're using more energy, and it's inefficient, so to speak, to do this. So it's what they call bad design argument. So atheists and evolutionists will say, well, if God created this, they're almost saying we're better designers. Like, we design things better. We would have designed it this way. We would have designed it so you don't have to use as much force, so it is more efficient. But there's a problem with that.
The problem is there would be lots of other issues with our body. So if this tendon didn't attach right here, it attached way down here, yeah, I could lift things with less energy, or I could lift heavier things, but then I'd have to have this big structure stretching out across here, which would cause other problems. So whenever we're doing design, we talk about optimization. We're trying to get the best that we can for all the different functions that we're doing. So we would say God has designed our bodies in an optimal way. He's the ultimate designer. And when engineers want to design things, what do they look at?
They're
God's creation.
Right. It's called biomimicry.
Biomimicry. So we're going to mimic what God's already created. And that'll be kind of we'll talk about that in a second with our featured DVD. Okay, so basic quick overview. When we think about our arm, it does amazing things and can twist and turn in crazy ways. Okay, whether we're talking about the abduction, adduction, about flexion, extension, whether it's supination, pronation, all those different motions that we make, our brain can control those, and I can wiggle things around in all kinds of different ways. So when we think about all of those pieces working together with the muscles, the bones, the tendons, the ligaments, the blood supply, the nerves, how that sends chemical signals to our brains, how we get energy to those muscles. It's amazingly complex. And it just should remind us of how awesome God is and how amazing He's made our bodies.
And maybe sometime we can talk about even the brain and how we even know which parts of the brain control which of the muscles.
Yeah.
I mean, it's called the homunculus. I'm going to get it wrong because I just thought of it off the top of my head.
Yes.
But there's a sensory one and a motor one. And so we can actually pinpoint which parts of the brain are responsible for those things. Then you have an area designated in your brain for
Yes,
that.
to do all those things.
So that's like way cool in my opinion.
And these are muscles that we can control voluntarily. There are other muscles in our body like your heart. How many of you are thinking right now about your heart beating? But it's still doing it.
Right.
How many of you are thinking right now about breathing? But it's still doing it. So we've got these voluntary and involuntary centers in our brains that control all those different systems.
And we got one more question here. So you talked about hypermobility, but they said, what is it when you have less movement in your joints and muscles?
Arthritis or olditis. I guess the term for that would be hypomobility. So hypo and hyper are the opposite senses. So if you think about hyper, that means above. So if you're hyperactive, you have too much activity. If you're hypoactive, or a word you might know about is hypodermic. Hypodermic needles go under the skin. So hypo means below. Hypothermia means your temperature's too low. So I guess the term for that would be hypomobility. If you didn't have a full range of motion in those things. And that can be caused by things like scar tissue building up,
inflammation
of the joints. And I experience that every day as we grow old. Yep. Something to look forward to, kids.
So enjoy the time to exercise and move around and do all those things while you're young.
All right. So we want to feature a product for you today. This is a DVD called The Uniqueness of Man, and it's from Professor Stuart Burgess. He's a research scientist in the UK, and he talks about creating a mimic of the joints in the knee. He's designed joints for spacecraft and things that are launching satellites and deploying solar panels, and how he uses God's design to look to that and trusting Him to build all of those amazing things that He does.
And we also now have a new special, so you want to take advantage of this. So if you, I gotta read it. If you purchase over $50 in merchandise, you will get free shipping on that. So that's a really great deal. So take advantage of that, and that's until we open again.
Yes.
So we hope that's a short period of time. So take advantage of it now and be able to use some of those products for schooling or even for some summertime fun activities.
Yeah. And the live programs are going to be continuing through the rest of the week. We'll have stuff happening today at noon and 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock. All those times are Eastern for those of you guys who aren't in the right time zone. And we are thankful you got to join us again today, and glad we got to answer some of your questions. We pray that God will bless you today and that you will have time to get out and enjoy God's creation, even if it's touching and feeling your arm right in your own living room.